had always wanted to build my own small cabin. Not some luxury getaway, just a simple, one-room place where I could spend weekends away from the noise of everyday life. I finally got the chance when I inherited a small patch of land from my uncle. It was deep in the woods, about an hour from the nearest town. The land had been in the family for years, but no one had done anything with it. It was just trees, hills, and a small stream running along the edge of the property. It took months of planning. I gathered supplies, worked out the layout, and made sure I had everything I needed. I wanted to do it alone, partly because I liked the challenge and partly because I wanted the solitude. The idea of spending weeks out there working by myself was something I looked forward to. No distractions, no people, just me, my tools, and the land. I drove out in early September, hoping to finish before winter made things too difficult. My truck was packed with wood, nails, concrete mix for the foundation, and all the tools I needed. The road leading to the property was just a dirt path, barely wide enough for my truck. It hadn't been used in years, and I had to stop a few times to clear fallen branches. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. I set up a small campsite a few yards from where the cabin would be. I had a tent, a fire pit, and enough food and water to last at least a week before I'd need to drive back into town for more. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, staring up at the stars, listening to the distant sounds of the woods. No cars, no voices, just crickets, the occasional owl, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The next morning, I got to work. First, I cleared the ground where the cabin would sit. The soil was tough, filled with roots and rocks, but after hours of digging, I had a flat surface. I poured the concrete footings and set the wooden posts that would support the floor. It was slow, exhausting work, but satisfying. By the end of the first day, I had the basic foundation in place. That night, as I sat by the fire, I started to feel the isolation. The woods felt darker than before. The sounds seemed louder, closer. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I found myself looking over my shoulder more than usual. By the third day, I had the floor and most of the walls framed. The work was going faster than I expected, and I was making good progress. But something started to feel off. I kept finding things slightly different from how I left them. A tool moved just a few inches. A pile of wood slightly shifted. I told myself I was just tired, that I must have moved them without realizing it. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. A soft, deliberate rustling in the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were too big, too wide. I tried to convince myself they were just an animal's, maybe a bear, but they looked too human. I told myself I was being paranoid. I kept working, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my gut. The walls were up and I had started on the roof. Every night, the sounds came back. The rustling, the snapping of twigs, always just far enough away that I couldn't see anything, but close enough that I knew something was out there. One morning, I woke up to find deep scratch marks on one of the wooden posts. For long, jagged lines, like something had clawed at it. They were too deep to be from a raccoon or a coyote. It had to be something bigger, something strong. That night, I barely slept. I sat by the fire, keeping my axe within reach. The sounds didn't stop. This time, they were closer. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy. I held my breath, listening. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the trees. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound was gone. The first light, I made a decision. I wasn't leaving, not yet. I had worked too hard to give up now. I reinforced the cabin, boarding up the windows and making sure the door was solid. I finished the roof and sealed every gap I could find. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to make it easy for it to get in. For a few days, nothing happened. I started to think maybe it was just an animal passing through, that maybe I had scared it off. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of something pressing against the cabin wall. It was a slow, dragging motion, like someone running their hand along the wood. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, a long, slow scratch ran across the outside of the door. I gripped my axe, heart pounding. The scratching stopped. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. The next morning, I packed my things. I took my axe, my knife, and as much as I could carry. I made my way back to the truck, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it. I wasn't alone. As I reached my truck, I saw something in the dirt. More footprints, deep, too large to be mine. They led into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I got in, started the engine, and didn't look back. I never finished the cabin, never went back. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that something was watching me the entire time. I never liked staying at my grandma's cabin. It wasn't because I didn't love her. I did. But there was something about that place that made me uneasy. It sat deep in the woods, far from any neighbors, far from town, far from anything. The road leading there was just dirt and gravel, winding through miles of trees, cutting through thick, overgrown brush. Even as a kid, I hated how quiet it was, how the trees seemed to close in on the cabin, how the nights stretched on forever with nothing but the sound of the wind moving through the branches. Grandma never seemed bothered by it. She was a tough woman, born and raised in that cabin, never wanting to leave. It was a small place, just 2 rooms and a little kitchen. She had lived alone since my grandpa died years before I was born, and she had no plans to change that. The cabin was old, made of weathered logs, the roof covered in moss. The porch creaked when you stepped on it, and the windows rattled when the wind picked up. After she passed, the cabin was left to me. I was in my 30s then, living in the city, used to the noise and the movement of life around me. The idea of keeping the cabin didn't interest me much, but it had been in the family for generations. Selling it felt wrong. I told myself I'd go there for a weekend, clean it out, fix what needed fixing, maybe even consider keeping it as a quiet getaway. The drive there felt longer than I remembered. The trees had grown thicker, the road narrower. When I reached the cabin, it looked exactly the same, unchanged, untouched. It had been over a year since Grandma died, but it felt like she had just been there. Her old rocking chair still sat on the porch, the wind making it shift slightly. Inside, the air was stale, the scent of old wood and dust thick in my nose. Everything was where she had left it. Her knitted blankets on the couch, her little clock ticking softly on the wall. I set my bags down, feeling a weight settle in my chest. I spent the day cleaning, clearing out old things, sorting through boxes. The work kept me busy, but as the sun started to set, that old feeling crept back in. The unease, the sense that I wasn't alone. I chalked it up to memories, to the stillness of the place. I locked the doors that night, something I never remembered Grandma doing. The locks were old and stiff, and I had to force them into place. The bedroom felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against my ears, that made every small sound feel too loud. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then I heard it, something moving outside. It wasn't an animal. I grew up visiting this place, spending summers in these woods. I knew the sound of deer moving through brush, the shuffle of raccoons near the porch. This was different, slow, deliberate, footsteps. I sat up, my heart pounding. The footsteps moved around the cabin, circling. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, a stray hunter, maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. Then the porch creaked. I barely breathed. The footsteps stopped. Then a slow, dragging sound moved across the wood. My stomach twisted. Someone was out there. I reached for the flashlight by my bed, my hands shaking. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound, but I had to see. I crept to the window, keeping to the side so I wouldn't be seen. The porch was empty. The rocking chair had stopped moving. I stayed there for what felt like hours, but the footsteps never came back. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found tracks. Not boot prints, not barefoot impressions, drag marks. Deep, uneven trails in the dirt, leading from the woods to the porch and back again. I tried to reason with it. Maybe an animal had dragged something. Maybe the wind had shifted debris in the night. But deep down, I knew. I spent the day fixing what I could. Patching leaks, clearing out the shed. Anything to keep my mind off the night before. The sun dipped lower, the trees casting long shadows over the cabin. I locked the doors early that night. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. They were closer this time. Slow, heavy. They stopped outside the door. A scraping sound, like nails against the wood. I held my breath. My fingers curled around the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't move. Then a soft knock. Not hard, not urgent. Just a single, deliberate tap. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then hours. The footsteps didn't return, but I didn't close my eyes until the sky turned gray with morning. I wanted to leave, but something kept me there, stubbornness, maybe. Fear of what I'd find if I left and came back later. That afternoon, I checked the door. There were marks on it. Deep, jagged scratches near the handle. Something had tried to get in. That night, I sat by the window, a knife in my lap. I didn't know what I was waiting for. The footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop. They moved around the cabin, slow and steady, circling. I gripped the knife tighter. Then, just like the night before, a knock. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then another. Then another. Slow, steady. Pattern. I forced myself to look at the window. Through the glass, just barely visible in the dark, was a figure. Not standing, not walking, crawling. A person on all fours moving along the porch. Their head turned toward me. I couldn't see their face. Just the shape of it, too long, too low to the ground. The knocking continued, though they weren't near the door anymore. It was a game. A sick, deliberate game. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Then, as slowly as it had come, it left, crawling back into the woods. I left at sunrise. I never went back. The cabin still stands. The land still belongs to me, but I will never step foot there again. Some places are meant to be left alone. It was supposed to be a quiet trip, just a weekend away in the woods, away from the city noise, away from everything. I had taken enough vacations like this before, enough to know the routine. Pack light, bring only the essentials, stay in a cabin just far enough from civilization to feel alone, but not so far that I couldn't get help if I needed it. I had never needed help before. This time was different. I booked a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. It was a last-minute decision, something I had found through a local listing. The pictures looked fine. A simple one-bedroom wooden cabin, a porch with a view of the trees, a fire pit out front. No neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. That was exactly what I wanted. The road leading to the cabin was rough, barely a road at all. I drove slowly, my tires struggling over loose gravel and muddy patches. The forest was dense, thick with tall pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No more distant hum of traffic, no sounds of people, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just like it had in the pictures. Small, weathered, but sturdy. There was a small porch with an old wooden chair, a pile of firewood stacked neatly beside the door. The air was crisp and cold, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my lungs. I unpacked quickly, setting my bag inside by the old wooden table. The inside was just as simple as I expected. One room, a bed pushed against the far wall, a tiny kitchen with a gas stove, and a wood-burning fireplace. The bathroom was small but clean. There was a single window above the sink showing nothing but trees. The first day passed quietly. I spent the evening chopping some wood, making a small fire in the pit outside. I sat there for a while, watching the flames, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Nothing felt off. Nothing felt strange. That changed on the second night. It started with small things. A noise outside, something moving just beyond the tree line. I thought it was an animal, probably a deer, maybe a bear. I had seen fresh tracks near the cabin earlier, so it wasn't surprising. Then I noticed something else. The feeling of being watched. I shrugged it off at first. It was easy to get paranoid out here, alone in the dark, with only the trees and the wind for company. But as the hours passed, the feeling didn't go away. I kept looking toward the trees, expecting to see something move, but there was nothing. That night, I locked the door. I double-checked the windows. I made sure my knife was within reach before I fell asleep. The third day was colder. The wind had picked up overnight, and the air had a sharp bite to it. I spent the morning collecting firewood, making sure I had enough to last me through another cold night. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud near the tree line. Too big to be an animal, too defined to be old. They led from the trees toward the cabin, stopping just a few feet from the porch. Someone had been here. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tracks. My first thought was that maybe it was another camper, someone passing through. But the nearest cabin was miles away. The nearest town was even farther. I followed the tracks, my heart pounding. They circled the cabin, leading to the back door before disappearing into the woods again. Whoever it was, they had come close. Close enough to look inside. Close enough to watch me. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every little sound made my skin crawl. The wind rattling the branches, the creak of the old wooden walls. I kept glancing at the window, expecting to see a face staring back at me. Night came fast. The sun barely had time to set before the darkness swallowed the cabin. I sat by the fireplace, listening. The wind howled outside, but I could still hear something else. Something moving. Slow, careful footsteps on the porch. I held my breath. Then 3 knocks. Soft, deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My knife was still on the table just a few feet away, but I didn't reach for it. I just sat there, heart pounding, staring at the door. Then nothing. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't hear anything else. I didn't look outside. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I grabbed the knife, keeping it close as I checked the locks again. Everything was still secure. I barely slept that night. The 4th day, I decided to leave. I packed my bag, threw everything into the truck, and started the engine. The relief I felt as I backed out of the driveway was overwhelming. I just wanted to be away from that place, away from whatever was out there. I didn't even make it a mile before I saw the figure, standing in the middle of the road. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see a face, just the shape of a person standing perfectly still. I slammed on the brakes, For a long time, we just stared at each other. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, backing up as fast as I could. My tires skidded over the rough road, the cabin coming back into view. I had no choice. I couldn't drive past them. I jumped out of the truck, running back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it, my breath coming in short, fast gasps. Then footsteps, coming up the porch. Slow, deliberate, the same 3 knocks. I gripped the knife, every muscle in my body tensed. The doorknob turned, locked, silence. Then a whisper, something low, almost too quiet to hear. Then footsteps again, walking away. I waited for hours before I dared to move. When the sun finally started to rise, I grabbed my keys and bolted for the truck. The road was empty. The figure was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I told the sheriff everything. He listened, nodding slowly, but I could tell he didn't believe me. When he finally agreed to check the cabin, I followed him back. Everything looked normal.
No footprints.
No signs that anyone had been there. But the door was wide open. Inside, on the table, was a single object. My knife. I had left it in the cabin. I was sure of it. But the blade was different now. It was clean. Too clean. As if someone had wiped it down. I never went back. I never found out who they were. And I don't want to. It was just past midnight when I reached the cabin. The road leading up to it was barely visible, the rain turning the dirt into a thick sludge that clung to my boots with every step. The wind howled through the trees, and the tall pines swayed under the pressure, their trunks creaking like old bones. My flashlight cut through the darkness in thin beams, barely illuminating the path ahead. This was my husband's old cabin. One he used whenever he needed to be away from everything. He was an agent, always working cases that he couldn't talk about. When he passed, I didn't know what to do with myself. His work had always kept him distant, and now that he was gone, I realized I had never really understood the full extent of what he did. But this cabin? This was the one place that was truly his. He came here to clear his mind, to escape whatever cases were weighing on him. And now, for the first time, I was stepping into his world. I didn't even know why I had come. Maybe I thought it would bring me closer to him, to the life he had before he was gone. Maybe I just wanted to feel like I was doing something instead of sitting in the house alone, staring at the walls that once held our life together. Either way, I was here now, and the longer I stood outside in the rain, the colder I got. The cabin was small, tucked deep into the woods where no one could find it unless they knew where to look. The wooden structure was old but sturdy, built by hand long before my husband ever owned it. I had only been here once before, years ago, and I barely remembered anything about it. I reached the porch and pulled out the key. It was an old brass one, the kind that felt heavy in your palm. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the wood creaking beneath my feet. The air was thick with dust, the smell of old pine mixing with something stale. I clicked on the light switch, and a single dim bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows against the walls. Inside, everything was just as he had left it. His old coat still hung on the back of a wooden chair near the small dining table. Papers were stacked in neat piles on the desk near the window. A coffee cup, long dried and cracked, sat on the counter near the sink. It was as if he had only just left and would walk back in at any moment. I ran my fingers along the surface of the desk, feeling the rough grain of the wood. The papers were official, some with government letterheads, others with notes scribbled in his familiar handwriting. I wasn't sure if I should read them, but my curiosity got the best of me. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning over names and dates that meant nothing to me. Then I found something that made my stomach drop. It was a map, hand-drawn, with circles and lines connecting different locations. Some of the spots were labeled with names I didn't recognize, while others were left blank. And in the corner of the map, scrawled in his handwriting, was one word: Watcher. I didn't know what it meant, but something about it made my skin crawl. I folded the map and placed it in my pocket. Maybe it was nothing, just another one of his case notes. But something about the way it was hidden beneath the stacks of papers made me feel like it was important. I spent the next hour looking through more of his things, trying to piece together what he had been working on before he died. Most of it didn't make sense to me. Case files, reports, photographs of places I didn't recognize. But the one thing that stood out the most was a notebook tucked beneath the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside, he had written notes in a rushed, almost frantic script. Asterisk, the cabin isn't safe anymore. I hear them at night. They know I'm here. Asterisk, asterisk, if I disappear, it won't be an accident. Asterisk, asterisk, they watch from the trees. They never come close, but they're always there. Asterisk, my blood ran cold. I read the words over and over again, trying to make sense of them. Was he just being paranoid? Or was there something real behind these fears? I turned to look out the window, and that's when I saw it. A shape, barely visible against the darkness, standing at the edge of the tree line. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I turned off the light. For a long moment, I stood in the dark, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. I didn't know if they could see me, if they knew I had spotted them. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. Slowly, I moved toward the window again, my body pressed against the wall. The figure was gone. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something wasn't right. I needed to leave. I grabbed the notebook and the map, stuffing them into my bag. I didn't care about anything else. I just needed to get back to my car. But as I reached the door, I heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the porch. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle. I couldn't tell if they were trying to get in or just standing there, waiting. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. I forced myself to count to 10, then 20, then 30. Silence. I didn't know if they were still there or if they had left, but I couldn't stay. I turned the handle and threw the door open. Nothing. The porch was empty. The forest beyond it was still. But I knew better. I stepped outside, moving quickly but carefully. The rain had slowed, but the wind still howled through the trees. I kept my flashlight low, scanning the ground in front of me as I made my way to the car. Then, just as I reached the driver's side door, I saw them again. Not just one figure this time, 3, standing in the trees, barely visible against the darkness. Watching, I didn't hesitate. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, and for a brief moment, I saw them clearly, dressed in dark clothing, faces obscured, not moving, not running, just watching. I hit the gas, the tires kicking up mud as I sped away from the cabin, the headlights bouncing along the uneven road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until the sun started to rise, stopping only when I was too exhausted to continue. My husband had always been secretive about his work, but now I knew something had been following him, watching him, and maybe, just maybe, they had been waiting for me to come back to that cabin. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back. It was the middle of November when I first heard about the cabin. I was between jobs at the time, taking whatever work I could find. A friend of mine, Paul, told me about a guy who needed someone to watch over his property for a few months. He was heading out of the country, and his cabin, tucked away deep in the woods, needed someone to keep an eye on it. No heavy lifting, no real responsibilities beyond keeping it in decent shape, making sure no squatters or animals moved in, and reporting back if anything went wrong. The pay was decent, and I didn't have much else going on, so I took the job. The place was about 30 miles from the nearest town, hidden deep in the forest at the end of a dirt road. I had to drive nearly 45 minutes off the highway just to get there, my truck bouncing over uneven ground, the trees pressing in from both sides. The air was colder in the woods, damp and thick with the smell of moss and wet earth. The cabin itself was small, just a single-story wooden structure with a pitched roof and a covered porch. It had a wood stove, a propane-powered generator, and a well out back for water. No internet, no phone service, just a radio that barely picked up anything but static. There was an old shed a few yards behind the cabin, stocked with firewood and a few tools. The guy who owned the place, some older man I never met, had left it well stocked with canned food, dry goods, and basic supplies. The deal was simple: stay there, keep things in order, and leave once he got back in February. The first few nights were fine. The quiet took some getting used to, but I liked the solitude. There was something peaceful about it. I'd wake up, chop some wood, make coffee, and sit on the porch, watching the trees sway in the wind. But then little things started to happen. At first, I didn't think much of them. One morning, I found the shed door slightly open. I was sure I had closed it the night before, but maybe I hadn't latched it properly. A few days later, I noticed small things out of place in the cabin. A chair slightly moved. A can of beans I didn't remember taking out sitting on the counter. The back door unlocked when I was sure I had locked it. It was easy to brush off. Maybe I was just being forgetful, maybe I wasn't used to the place yet. But then I started hearing noises. At night, when the wind had died down and the forest was still, I'd hear faint sounds outside, a twig snapping, a soft rustling in the leaves, the kind of noises you'd expect from an animal, except they never sounded quite right. They were too deliberate, too controlled. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. They were slow, careful, moving around the perimeter. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped near the back door. I reached for the shotgun the owner had left behind, gripping it tightly, my palms slick with sweat. I didn't move. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, I forced myself to get up, moving quietly to the window. I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The trees stood still, their branches barely shifting in the faint wind. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no tracks, no signs of anything unusual, but I knew what I had heard. For the next few days, I kept the shotgun within arm's reach. More things started happening. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I walked outside to get some firewood. The shed door was open again. This time, I knew I had closed it. I walked over, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. I pushed the door open fully, expecting to find an animal inside. But there was nothing. Nothing except for a single footprint in the dirt floor. Not mine, not an animal's. It was a boot print. Someone had been in there. I spent the rest of the evening locked inside the cabin, the shotgun resting across my lap. That night, the noises came back. Footsteps, slow and methodical, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the gun, waiting. Then, just before dawn, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of the front doorknob turning. It rattled once, twice, then stopped. Whoever it was didn't try to force their way in. They just tested the lock. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found more footprints outside. They led from the treeline to the porch, stopping just in front of the door before disappearing back into the woods. That was enough for me. I packed up my things, loaded up my truck, and left. I didn't care about the job, about the money. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I drove straight to town and told Paul what had happened. He didn't say much, just listened with a tight expression. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. The guy who owned the cabin, he hadn't hired anyone to watch over it. He had left the country months ago. There was never supposed to be anyone staying there. I left town that same day. I don't know who was out there in those woods with me, and I don't want to find out. I had been working deep in the forest for years, making my living as a woodsman. It wasn't an easy life, but I preferred it over anything else. The solitude, the work, and the simple rhythm of nature, everything about it suited me. I had no wife, no family left to speak of, just me and the land. The year was 1998. I had been cutting timber near a remote part of the woods, miles from any town or settlement. I knew these woods well, better than most, and I'd learned to respect them. Out here, you had to be careful. The land didn't care about you. It didn't care if you were tired, hungry, or lost. It would swallow you up without a trace if you let your guard down. I had a small cabin of my own, but that evening, as the sky darkened and the wind started picking up, I realized I was too far out to make it back before nightfall. I had spent the day working farther than I planned, and now, with the light fading fast, I knew I had to find shelter. That's when I remembered the old cabin. I had seen it before, maybe a year or two back, while scouting the land for fresh timber. It was abandoned, just a crumbling structure deep in the woods, long forgotten by whoever built it. I hadn't paid much attention to it at the time, but now it seemed like my best option. I made my way through the trees, my axe strapped to my back, boots crunching over the damp forest floor. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the first drops of rain had started to fall. By the time I reached the cabin, the storm was already rolling in. The place looked worse than I remembered. The wood was rotting, the roof sagging in places, and the windows were broken. It had clearly been abandoned for years. The door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the wooden floor. It smelled of damp rot and old wood. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by my entrance. There was an old table pushed against the far wall, a rusted stove, and a wooden cot with a stained mattress. A few broken chairs were scattered around, and the walls were covered in scratches, long, deep gouges in the wood. Something about them unsettled me. They weren't the kind of marks you'd expect from age or weather. They looked intentional. I shrugged it off. It wasn't my place to wonder about the past. I just needed a place to rest until morning. I set my pack down, placed my axe within reach, and sat on the edge of the cot. The rain had started coming down harder now, hammering against the roof. The wind whistled through the broken windows, making the whole cabin groan. I told myself I'd sleep lightly, just a few hours, enough to rest before heading back. But then I heard it. A sound from outside. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe. But as I sat there, listening, I realized it wasn't. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Someone was out there. I reached for my axe, gripping the handle tight. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. Then came the sound of breathing, slow, heavy, right outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then the door, which I had left slightly open, began to creak. Someone was pushing it. I tightened my grip on the axe, Every muscle in my body tensed. The door moved an inch, then another, and then silence. Whoever was out there wasn't coming in. I sat there, barely breathing, waiting. The rain pounded against the roof. The wind howled through the broken windows, but the presence outside didn't move. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe an hour, maybe more. Eventually, the footsteps started again, this time moving away. I listened as they disappeared into the storm. I didn't sleep. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn crept through the broken windows, I gathered my things and stepped outside. The forest was eerily silent, the ground slick with rain. I looked around, expecting to see footprints in the mud, but there were none. I checked the area near the door. Nothing. The ground was soft. If someone had been standing there, I should have seen their tracks. But the earth was untouched. I stood there, gripping my axe, trying to make sense of it. I had heard the footsteps. I had heard the breathing. I knew someone had been there, but there was no sign of them. I left without looking back. I made it home that afternoon, my mind still turning over what had happened. I told myself it was my imagination, that the storm had played tricks on my ears. But I never went back to that cabin. I never wanted to, because deep down, I knew whatever had been outside that night, it had never really left, and it was still out there, waiting. I had never been one for family drama. I kept my head down, showed up to gatherings when necessary, and stayed out of everyone's personal business. But when my aunt, Lisa, asked me to help her clear out a remote cabin that she once owned with her ex-husband, I didn't hesitate. She didn't say much about it, just that she wanted someone there for safety, and I was one of the few people she trusted. It was early November when we made the drive. The cabin sat deep in the forests of British Columbia, where the roads grew narrow and rough, the cell service faded, and the wilderness stretched on for miles. The last time my aunt had been there was years ago, before her divorce. She didn't speak much about her ex, but from what little I knew, the split hadn't been amicable. I was in my early 30s then, young enough to think I was invincible but old enough to know better. My aunt was in her late 40s, tough and independent, the type of woman who rarely asked for help. The fact that she wanted me there told me all I needed to know. This trip wasn't just about clearing out an old cabin. There was something else. We left early in the morning, driving for hours before the paved roads gave way to gravel. The deeper we went, the more isolated it felt. By the time we reached the property, the sun was already starting to set. The cabin was in worse shape than I expected. The wood was weathered and cracked, the roof sagged slightly in places, and the front porch looked unstable. Weeds had grown up through the cracks in the foundation, and the surrounding trees pressed in close, making the entire place feel claustrophobic. Lisa parked the truck and killed the engine. We sat there for a moment, neither of us speaking. Something about the place felt wrong. I chalked it up to the natural eeriness of being so isolated. But as I stepped out of the truck and took a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air, a strange sense of unease settled over me. We made our way inside, forcing the stubborn door open. The air was stale, thick with dust and old wood. The inside was just as neglected as the outside. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and dead leaves had blown in through a broken window. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had gone yellow with age. Lisa moved through the cabin with purpose, checking the rooms, peering into the kitchen, running her fingers over the surfaces as if trying to remember something. I started gathering things, shoving them into boxes, assuming that was why we were here. Then I noticed her staring at a door at the end of the hallway. It was a simple wooden door, slightly ajar. From where I stood, I could see the top of a staircase leading down. "The basement?" I asked. Lisa nodded but didn't move. I waited for her to say something, but she just kept staring, her fingers twitching at her sides. I had never seen her look nervous before. "I'll check it out," I said, grabbing a flashlight from my bag. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended. The air grew colder the further down I went, and the smell of damp wood filled my nose. When I reached the bottom, I swept the flashlight around. It was a typical basement. Unfinished walls, concrete floor, wooden beams exposed in the ceiling. Old furniture and storage boxes were stacked against the walls, covered in dust and mildew. Then the beam of my flashlight landed on something that made my stomach drop. A sleeping bag. It was unzipped and partially crumpled, as if someone had been using it recently. Next to it, a plastic bag filled with canned food and bottled water. A hunting knife lay on the ground beside it, its blade dull with use. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. Someone had been staying here. I turned to head back upstairs when I heard something behind me, a soft creak. I swung the flashlight around, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I took another step back, and the floor groaned beneath me. Then I saw it, just a flicker of movement in the far corner of the basement, a shadow shifting in the darkness. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, nearly slamming into Lisa at the top. "There's someone living down there," I said, breathless. Lisa's expression didn't change. She just nodded. That was when I realized she already knew. I opened my mouth to ask her what the hell was going on when something banged downstairs. Loud, heavy, like a door slamming shut. Lisa grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the truck. We weren't sticking around to find out who or what was down there. We made it to the truck just as another noise rang out, this time from the trees behind the cabin. A branch snapping, footsteps. Someone was out there. Lisa threw the truck into reverse, backing up so fast that the tires kicked up dirt. My heart pounded as I searched the darkness, flashlight clutched tightly in my hands. And then I saw him, a man standing just at the edge of the trees, half hidden by the shadows. He was tall, his clothes ragged and dirty, his face obscured by the darkness. He didn't move. He just watched as we sped away. Neither of us spoke until we hit the main road. Lisa gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. "I knew he'd still be there," she muttered. I turned to her, my chest still heaving. "Who?" She didn't answer right away. "My ex-husband."
Is Certa here?
"You're telling me that was him?" She nodded, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I thought he was in prison." He was. The implications sank in, chilling me to my core. Lisa took a deep breath. "That's why I brought you. I knew if I came alone, I might not make it back." We drove the rest of the way in silence, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that Lisa never went back to that cabin, and neither did I. I had been living in that cabin for almost a year when I found the body. The cabin was mine, tucked away deep in the woods, a place I had bought after leaving my old life behind. I wasn't running from anything, not exactly, but I needed something different. The world had become too much, too loud, too crowded, too full of people who wanted something from me. So I sold my house, packed my things, and moved to a place where nobody would bother me. The land was cheap because it was far from town. A 2-hour drive along a narrow road that turned into a dirt path the closer you got. I liked it that way. There was no need for visitors, no reason for anyone to come by unless I invited them. And I didn't invite anyone. For the first 6 months, life was simple. I had solar panels for power, a well for water, and a wood stove for heat. I spent my days chopping wood, fixing small things around the cabin, and hunting when I needed fresh meat. I drove to town once a month for supplies, kept to myself, and enjoyed the silence. But in the 11th month, something changed. It started with little things, small details that felt off. One evening, I noticed footprints in the dirt outside my cabin. They weren't mine. They were fresh, slightly deeper than my own, and they led toward the trees. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had made them earlier and just forgotten. Maybe they were from an animal, though they looked too clean, too human. Then I started hearing noises at night. I wasn't the type to scare easily, but there were moments when I would wake up to the sound of something moving outside. Sometimes it was soft, branches snapping in the distance, leaves rustling as if something large had passed through. Other times it was closer, a distinct crunch of footsteps near my porch. I started sleeping with my rifle next to me. By the time I reached a full year in that cabin, I was convinced that someone had been coming around. I locked my doors every night, checked the windows twice, and made sure my rifle was loaded before I went to bed. And then I smelled it. Rot. It was subtle at first, just a hint of something foul in the air. I thought maybe an animal had died nearby. It wasn't uncommon. The woods were full of life and death. But as the days passed, the smell didn't go away. It got worse. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from under the cabin. My cabin was built on a raised foundation, just a few feet off the ground. Enough space for air to circulate, for rain to drain away. It wasn't a place I ever looked. There was no reason to, but that day I had to. I took a flashlight, got down on my knees, and looked underneath. At first, I didn't see anything, just darkness, dirt, and dead leaves. But then my light caught something pale, a shape that didn't belong. A hand. I froze. For a long moment, I didn't move. I barely breathed. My eyes locked on the hand, fingers curled slightly, skin stretched tight over the bone. It didn't look fresh. The flesh had started to turn gray, and the nails were dirty, caked with mud. I wanted to believe I was wrong, that it was something else. But I knew what I was looking at. It took me a while to work up the courage to crawl underneath. The smell was thick, heavy in my throat, but I forced myself forward, dragging my body across the dirt. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Then I saw the rest of it. A man, curled up on his side, his face half buried in the dirt. His clothes were torn, soaked with stains that had long since dried. His body had started to bloat, skin splitting in places where decay had taken hold. His eyes were open, but they saw nothing. I scrambled back so fast I hit my head on the wooden beams of the cabin. My mind raced. Who was he? How did he get here? How long had he been under my cabin? The smell suggested weeks, maybe longer, but I had no idea. I had never seen him before. I didn't recognize his face, his clothes, anything about him. And then something hit me. The footprints, the noises at night. Had someone else put him here? The thought made my skin crawl. If someone had killed this man and stashed his body under my cabin, were they still around? Were they watching me now? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my chair, rifle across my lap, staring at the door. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow outside the window felt like it was moving. I didn't call the police right away. I don't know why. Maybe because I was in shock. Maybe because I didn't want to deal with it. But by the next morning, I knew I had no choice. I drove to town, found the sheriff's office. When I told them what I found, they looked at me like I was crazy. But they came. They went under the cabin, pulled the body out, examined it. The sheriff didn't say much, just muttered something about needing an autopsy. I stood there, watching as they loaded the body into a black bag. Then the sheriff turned to me and asked if I had any enemies. That question sat with me for a long time, because I didn't, at least not that I knew of. but someone had left that body under my cabin, and they had been around watching, maybe waiting. After the police left, I stayed in town for a few days. Couldn't go back. Not yet. When I finally did, the cabin didn't feel the same. The woods felt darker. The silence felt heavier. And every night, as I locked my doors and checked the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching, waiting. Maybe they had never left. I never expected to end up alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana, but life had a way of forcing decisions on me. It was late October 2019, and I had left everything behind: my job, my apartment, and most of the people I used to know. I needed space to breathe, to think, and to figure things out. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my father's, a man named Roger who had passed away years ago. His family never used the place anymore, and they didn't mind letting me stay there for as long as I wanted. The drive out was long. Once I passed the last gas station, it was another 30 miles of rough, winding roads before I reached the place. It sat alone on a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees. There were no neighbors, no phone service, and no power lines. The only way in or out was the dirt road I had driven up on, and even that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The cabin itself was old but solid. Thick logs made up the walls, and the roof had a steep pitch to keep snow from piling up too much in the winter. The inside was simple: one main room with a kitchen, a wood stove for heat, a small bedroom, and a bathroom that ran on a well system. There was a generator out back, but I planned to use it as little as possible to conserve fuel. The place had been stocked with canned goods and other supplies long ago, and aside from dust and a few mouse droppings, it was in decent shape. The first couple of nights were uneventful. The woods were quiet, aside from the wind in the trees and the occasional sound of animals moving through the brush. I spent my time chopping wood, cleaning up, and adjusting to the silence. Felt good to be away from everything. But then, things started to feel off. I noticed it first when I was splitting wood in the afternoon. I had this strange feeling, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia and kept working, but the feeling never really went away. At night, it got worse. I'd sit by the wood stove, reading by lantern light, and I'd hear sounds outside. Footsteps, maybe, or branches snapping. I told myself it was just deer or elk moving through, but there was something different about it. It didn't sound like animals. It sounded like someone walking. One night, I woke up to a noise right outside my window. It was close, too close. My heart pounded as I reached for the rifle I kept by the bed. The cabin had thick wooden shutters, so I couldn't see out, but I could hear something moving. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Then, nothing. Just silence. I stayed awake until dawn, barely moving. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself to step outside. There were tracks in the dirt, boot prints. Not fresh, but not too old either. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows and the door. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen another person in days, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here. I told myself it could have been an old set of tracks, maybe from hunters passing through before I got here. I wanted to believe that, but deep down I knew it wasn't true. That day, I double-checked everything. I made sure the door locks were secure. I checked the shutters on the windows. I loaded the rifle. Then, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any sign of where the tracks led. They disappeared into the woods, heading toward the hills in the distance. There was no road that way, no reason for anyone to be out there. The next night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern on low and listened. Around midnight, I heard it again, soft footsteps moving outside. This time, they didn't circle the cabin. They stopped, right by the door. I gripped the rifle so tight my hands ached. I thought about calling out, but what would I even say? Minutes passed. maybe an hour. Then the footsteps started again, walking away this time. I listened until the sound faded into the woods. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed what little I had and went outside to load up the truck. That's when I saw something that made my stomach turn. The footprints were back. Fresh ones, in the dirt right outside my door. But this time, there weren't just a few. There were dozens. Like someone or several people had stood there for hours. And then I saw the scratches. Long, deep gouges in the wood, right beside the door frame. Not animal scratches. Human. Fingernails, maybe. Someone had been clawing at the wood, right next to where I had been sitting the night before. I threw everything in the truck as fast as I could. I didn't even bother going back inside. I started the engine and tore down the dirt road, my heart pounding the entire way. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away. Even then, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I never went back. I never found out who or what was out there. I told a few people about it, but no one believed me. They said I must have imagined it, or that it was just some drifter passing through. But I know what I saw. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been waiting. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I don't know why I still think about that night. Maybe it's because nothing ever really explained itself. Maybe it's because it made me realize how thin the line is between safety and real danger. Or maybe it's because I knew, deep in my gut, that if I had made even one mistake, I wouldn't be here telling this story. It happened in the fall of 2016. I was 35 back then, working as a contractor, mostly doing odd jobs that took me out into the wilderness. I had just finished a long project for a guy who wanted a cabin built deep in the woods of northern Montana. The place was way off the grid, miles from the nearest town. It wasn't unusual for me to be in the middle of nowhere, but this spot was something else. No cell service, no roads leading in, just a dirt trail barely wide enough for my truck. I had brought my dog with me, like I always did. His name was Cooper, a big, sturdy German Shepherd mix I'd had since he was a pup. He was the best kind of company, always alert but never nervous. The kind of dog that didn't bark unless he had a reason. The job was done, but I had one last night to spend in the cabin before heading back. The owner wasn't moving in for another month, and he told me I could use the place as long as I needed. That suited me fine. I was dead tired, and the thought of sleeping in a solid structure instead of my tent sounded like a reward after weeks of work. The cabin wasn't fancy. One big open space, a wood stove for heat, a small loft for sleeping. It was just meant to be a hunting retreat, nothing more. The surrounding land was thick with trees, dense enough that even during the day, the sunlight barely made it through. At night, it was pitch black. I settled in for the evening, cooked up some canned chili on the stove, and gave Cooper his food. He ate like usual, then curled up on his blanket near the door. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. That changed a few hours later. I woke up to the sound of Cooper growling, a deep, low rumble that I'd only heard a few times before, usually when a coyote got too close to camp. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my mind still sluggish from sleep. The cabin was dark, except for the faint glow of the wood stove. Cooper was standing now, ears up, body stiff. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the small window on the far side of the cabin. I didn't hear anything at first, just the sound of the wind outside, the usual creaks of the wooden walls settling in the cold. Then, from outside, the crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. Animals don't walk like that. I reached for the rifle I always kept nearby when I was out in the woods. It was an old .30-06, reliable and familiar. I didn't stand up yet. I just listened, Another crunch. Closer this time. The cabin had no electricity, just a few battery-powered lanterns. I didn't turn one on. I didn't want to light myself up for whoever or whatever was out there. Cooper let out another growl, then went completely still. The next sound was different. It wasn't footsteps. It was a soft tapping right against the wooden wall of the cabin. I held my breath. 3 slow taps, then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, heart pounding. Could have been a few minutes. Could have been an hour. Cooper stayed next to me, tense but quiet. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I forced myself to stay awake, listening. I thought about turning on the lantern, but something in me resisted. I wanted to stay hidden. Whoever was out there already knew I was inside, but I didn't want to make it easier for them to see me. Cooper finally relaxed a little, but he didn't lie back down. He just sat next to me, ears twitching at every little sound. The wind picked up outside. The old trees groaned, and then I heard it again. Not the footsteps, not the tapping, breathing. It was faint, but it was there, right outside the wall. A long, slow inhale, then another. Someone standing inches from the cabin, just breathing. I gripped my rifle tighter, every instinct in me screaming to do something. But I didn't. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I don't know how long it lasted. A minute, maybe 2, and then nothing. Cooper let out a soft whine, shifting closer to me. The rest of the night passed in stretches of silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the wind. I didn't sleep. I just sat there waiting. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I finally stood up. My legs were stiff, my body sore from staying in the same position for hours. Cooper moved with me, still on edge. I unlocked the door and stepped outside, rifle ready. The air was cold, the kind that bites into your lungs. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints. Not hiking shoes. Bare feet. The tracks led from the tree line to the cabin, stopping just outside the wall where I had heard the breathing. They stood there for a long time before finally turning back. I followed them as far as I could before they disappeared into the dense woods. No sign of who made them.
No explanation.
I didn't waste time packing up. I threw my gear into the truck, called for Cooper, and got the hell out of there. I never went back to that cabin. The owner never mentioned anything strange when he finally moved in. I didn't tell him about that night. Maybe I should have. Maybe it wouldn't have mattered. I still think about it sometimes. Who or what was out there? Why were they barefoot in the freezing cold? And what would have happened if I had opened the door? I don't think I want to know. I don't know why I took the job. I wasn't in a desperate situation or anything. But when my uncle told me he needed someone to watch over a small plot of land while he was away for a few months, I figured I could use the change of scenery. He owned a little cabin near an old graveyard in a rural part of the state, miles from the nearest town. It wasn't some creepy abandoned place. He used it for hunting and fishing, and it was kept in good shape. But he didn't want it sitting unattended for that long, and since he was willing to pay me, I agreed. Sounded simple. Stay at the cabin, check on the property, make sure no one messed with it. I wasn't thrilled about the graveyard being close by, but I'm not the kind of person who gets spooked easily. It was just a few old headstones from the 1800s, nothing special. The first week was peaceful. The cabin was simple. A small kitchen, a single bedroom, a bathroom, and a front porch that overlooked a narrow dirt path leading into the woods. A generator powered the essentials, and there was a well for water. Cell service was spotty, but I wasn't there to be on my phone. Days were slow. I'd make coffee in the morning, take short walks around the property, read a book, and sit on the porch with a beer in the evenings. By the second week, I started noticing things. It wasn't anything major, just small things that made me pause. I'd find the front door unlocked when I was sure I locked it. The generator would sputter and die in the middle of the night, even though I kept it fueled. I'd hear faint rustling sounds outside, like someone walking in the woods, but I never saw anyone. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. Then I found the footprints. It had rained the night before, turning the dirt near the graveyard into thick mud. When I walked out there the next morning, I saw them, bare footprints leading from the treeline to the oldest part of the graveyard. The prints were deep, like someone heavy had been walking, and they were spaced in a way that seemed unnatural. I followed them as they weaved between the headstones. There was no sign of them leaving, no return trail. It was like whoever made them had just stopped walking and vanished. I stood there for a long time, staring at the last footprint before the prints simply ended. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth. That night, I locked the door and made sure the rifle my uncle kept above the fireplace was loaded. The next few nights were worse. I started waking up at random hours, always feeling like someone was just outside the cabin. I'd lie still, listening. The wind would move through the trees, the old wooden porch creaking slightly. Sometimes I'd hear soft shuffling sounds, the kind you'd make if you were trying not to be heard. The third night, I woke up to the sound of breathing, not my own. It was coming from outside the bedroom window. Slow, deliberate breaths. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just listened. The sound was deep, steady, like whoever it was had been standing there for a long time. The window didn't have curtains, only an old mesh screen, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I was too afraid of what I might see. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped. The next morning, I went outside and checked the ground beneath the window. More footprints deep in the damp earth, standing in place right by the wall. I should have left, but I didn't. Something about the place held me there, like an unspoken challenge. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something closer to a growing unease, an instinct that told me something wasn't right, but I had to understand what was happening before I could leave. By the fourth week, the forest felt wrong. The trees seemed taller, thicker. The usual sounds of birds and insects faded. The air had a weight to it, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. The graveyard felt larger, like more headstones were appearing. I started hearing something else at night, not just breathing, soft, dragging sounds, like footsteps moving through grass, circling the cabin, slow and patient. One night, I sat by the window with the rifle on my lap, waiting. Around 2 a.m, I heard it, a dull thump on the porch. Then another. I gripped the rifle, my heart hammering. The third thump was heavier, closer to the door. I stood up, my hands sweaty against the wood of the rifle stock. I forced myself to take a step forward. Then another. I reached the door, pressed my ear against it. Silence. Then a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the porch. I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body locked up. The scraping sound stopped, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, stepping off the porch and into the grass. I waited until sunrise before I dared to open the door. There were deep scratch marks on the wooden planks, trailing from the front door to the steps. At the edge of the clearing, near the treeline, something small and dark lay in the grass. I forced myself to walk toward it. It was a single, rotted boot, a human boot. I left that morning. I didn't pack. I didn't clean up. I didn't care. I got in my truck and drove until I reached the highway, until I saw other cars, until I felt like I was back in the world I knew. My uncle never mentioned anything when he got back. I never told him what happened. I don't know if he would have believed me. I still think about that cabin sometimes, about the footprints, the breathing, the scraping sound on the porch. Something was out there, watching, waiting, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. I never planned on inheriting my grandfather's farm. It wasn't a big farm, just a few hundred acres of land stretching out beyond a lonely dirt road in the middle of nowhere. He'd lived there for decades, long after my grandmother passed away, and even though my dad had left the place behind as soon as he was old enough, my grandfather stayed. I only visited a handful of times when I was younger. I remembered the smell of old wood, the way dust floated in the air when the sun hit just right. The cabin was small, nothing more than a single-story structure with a loft. It had been built by hand, the wood warped by time, the nails rusting in their places. When my grandfather died, there wasn't much left behind. A few pieces of furniture, an old rifle, some tools. My father wanted to sell the land, but the cabin sat so deep in the middle of nowhere that it was hard to find a buyer. After months of back and forth, I told him I'd take care of it. I was between jobs, had no real place to be. The thought of spending time alone, away from everything, didn't sound so bad. I packed up my truck and drove out. The road stretched for miles, the trees on either side thick and overgrown. The gravel crunched under my tires, and every so often, I'd hit a rut deep enough to shake the whole truck. It had been years since I'd last been out this way, and I barely remembered the route. No houses, no streetlights, nothing but empty land and the occasional rusted fence post leaning at an angle. By the time I reached the property, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The cabin looked worse than I remembered. The roof sagged in places, the porch was covered in leaves, and the front door had a crack running through the middle of it. The air smelled damp, like the wood had been soaking up rain for too long. The nearest neighbor was at least 10 miles away, and the silence was thick, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every little sound. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs, and took it all in. I hadn't even been there a full minute before I had the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't something obvious. No footprints, no sounds of movement. Just an instinct, a feeling deep in my gut, like something wasn't quite right. I shook it off and grabbed my bags, heading up to the porch. The wood creaked under my weight, the boards brittle and cracked. Inside, the cabin was the way I remembered it. Dusty. The furniture was still there, an old couch against the wall, a wood-burning stove near the kitchen, a single bed in the corner, covered with a thin, moth-eaten blanket. The shelves were still stocked with canned food, some of it years old, the labels peeling. My grandfather had lived a simple life, never needed much. I spent the first few hours cleaning up, swept the floors, aired out the place. The first night was uneventful, just me getting used to the quiet. I read by candlelight until I got tired and eventually fell asleep. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed something was wrong. I was outside chopping wood, the sun setting behind the tree line, when I heard it, a rustling sound, too heavy to be the wind. I froze, my hands tightening around the axe. The sound came from the woods behind the cabin. I waited, my ears straining. Nothing. I turned back to my work, but the feeling didn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing there. That night, I locked the door. Not that it would have done much good. The lock was old, the kind that could probably be forced open with a strong enough push. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not the light sound of an animal, not the quick rustling of a raccoon or fox. These were heavy, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, my body frozen. The footsteps circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other. I wanted to tell myself it was my imagination, that it was just the woods settling, but I knew better. Then silence. I didn't move. I don't know how long I stayed like that, staring up at the ceiling, my heart pounding. Eventually, Exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I went outside, checking for tracks. I found them. They weren't animal tracks. They were footprints, barefoot. The prints were deep, like whoever had made them was heavy. They started at the tree line and led up to the cabin, circling it once before heading back into the woods. I stood there, my stomach twisting. I wasn't sure what to do. There was no one around for miles. No police station nearby, no neighbors to check in with. Just me and the woods. I told myself it was probably some drifter passing through. Someone looking for shelter, maybe realizing the cabin was occupied and moving on. But the uneasy feeling never left me. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the axe next to me, listening. The footsteps came back. Slower this time, more deliberate. They circled the cabin again, stopping just outside the front door. I held my breath. Then a sound. A soft, dragging sound, like something being pulled through the dirt. I wanted to look, to peek through the window, but something in me told me not to. I stayed still. The sound lasted for what felt like hours, then faded. The next morning, I found something new. A pile of bones, just a few feet from the porch. Animal bones, mostly. Small ones. A rabbit, maybe. But they were arranged in a pattern, a strange, almost deliberate shape. Not scattered. Placed. I packed my things. I didn't care about the farm, didn't care about the cabin. I grabbed what I could and threw it in the truck. As I turned onto the road, I looked in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the tree line, half hidden by the shadows, I saw him. A man. Tall, thin, standing perfectly still. He wasn't watching me. He was just there, standing. Like he had been there the whole time. I didn't slow down. I never went back. My father sold the land a year later. Some company bought it, probably tore the cabin down. I don't know. I never checked. I don't think about it much. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I wonder, how long had he been there? How many nights had he stood outside, watching? And what would have happened if I had opened the door? I never should have taken that job. Looking back, it was a stupid decision, but at the time, it seemed like easy money. I was hired to take care of a remote hunting cabin deep in the mountains of Montana for a full winter. The owner was some rich guy from out of state who only used it during hunting season, but he wanted someone to stay there year-round to keep it in good shape and keep trespassers away. The pay was decent, and I liked the idea of being alone for a while. I had just gotten out of a rough relationship and needed the time to clear my head. The cabin was about 50 miles from the nearest town, with only a long dirt road leading to it. The closest neighbor was maybe 10 miles away, just trees, mountains, and cold air. It was the kind of isolation that people dream about or fear, depending on the person. First, I loved it. Days were quiet, and the landscape was beautiful. I spent my mornings chopping wood, making sure I had enough for the fireplace to last the winter. Evenings were spent reading or just sitting by the fire. There was no cell service, but I had a satellite phone in case of emergencies. The owner had stocked the place with enough food to last for months, and there was a generator for power. But after a few weeks, something started to feel off. Started small. One night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or an elk. But as I listened, I realized the footsteps were too deliberate. Not the quick, nervous movements of a wild animal, but slow, heavy steps, circling the cabin. I grabbed my rifle and went to the window, but by the time I looked outside, there was nothing there. Just the dark woods and the wind howling through the trees. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow. They were human, barefoot. That didn't make any sense. No one would be out here without shoes, especially in the middle of winter. The tracks led from the edge of the tree line, circled the cabin, and then disappeared back into the woods. I tried to convince myself that it was some lost hiker, maybe someone suffering from hypothermia. But that didn't explain why they had come all the way up to my cabin, or why they had just stood outside my window. That night, I locked the doors and kept my rifle close. A few nights later, the smell started. I had stepped outside in the evening to grab some more firewood when I caught a whiff of something rotten. It was thick, heavy, like the stench of a dead animal, but worse. Clung to the air, making my stomach turn. I walked around the cabin, trying to find the source, but there was nothing, just the smell lingering. It lasted for hours, fading in and out. Sometimes it would disappear completely, only to come back stronger. I tried to ignore it, but something about it unsettled me. Then I started hearing the voices. It was late one night when I heard it, a voice calling my name. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The wind had a way of playing tricks on your ears out there. But then I heard it again, clearer, closer. Came from the woods. A slow, dragging voice, stretched out like someone struggling to speak. It didn't sound right. It was off, like someone imitating my voice but getting the tone wrong. I stayed inside that night, rifle in hand, listening as the voice circled the cabin. Called out again and again, each time sounding more like me. I didn't sleep. Days passed without incident, but I knew something was still out there. One evening, just before sundown, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was too far away to make out details, but it looked human, tall, thin, motionless. Just standing there, watching. I raised my rifle and shouted at it to leave, but it didn't move. It just stood there, staring. Then, in a single, unnatural movement, it dropped to all fours and ran into the trees. I felt sick. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. I should have left. I should have packed my things and driven away. But I told myself I was being paranoid. Then came the last night. The smell returned, stronger than ever. It seeped through the walls, filling the cabin. I felt nauseous, dizzy. Then the voices started again. But this time, they weren't just outside. They were inside. I heard my own voice coming from the next room. I heard my own voice whispering things I had never said. The air felt thick, heavy. I gripped my rifle, my hands shaking. Then the door to the cabin creaked open. I hadn't unlocked it. A shadow stepped inside. It was me. I was looking at myself. Same face, same clothes, but the eyes were wrong. Too dark, too empty. I smiled. I didn't hesitate. I raised the rifle and fired. The thing let out a shriek, something inhuman. A twisted, garbled sound that made my ears ring. Staggered back, then lunged. I fired again and again. It fell to the ground, convulsing, twisting in ways that no human body should move. Then, with one final guttural scream, it crawled out the door and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, gun in hand, waiting for sunrise. As soon as there was light, I grabbed my things and left. I never went back. It took me days to get back to town. When I finally arrived, I told the owner I was done. I didn't tell him what had happened. He didn't ask. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Somewhere, deep in those woods, it's still out there. And it knows my name. I never liked taking trips alone, but sometimes life forces you into situations you'd rather avoid. It was late autumn, 2016, when I found myself in the middle of the English countryside, driving through winding roads slick with rain, heading toward a remote cabin I had booked for the weekend. Work had been unbearable for the last few months. I needed the break, and I told myself this trip would help me clear my mind. The plan was simple. Spend 3 days in the cabin, away from my phone, emails, and the constant noise of the city. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The drive stretched longer than I expected. The roads narrowed as I got closer to my destination, bordered by thick trees that swayed under the heavy, gray sky. My phone signal had been gone for nearly an hour, and I hadn't seen another car in just as long. The GPS had stopped working, and I was left relying on the printed directions I had brought with me. I reached the cabin just before dusk. It was smaller than I had imagined, a simple wooden structure with a single porch light casting a dull glow against the darkening sky. The rain had turned to mist, clinging to the trees like a veil, making everything feel eerily silent. The cabin had been advertised as rustic and secluded, which was accurate. It sat at the edge of a forest with no neighbors, no nearby houses, nothing but miles of trees and an old dirt road leading back to the main road. I turned off the engine, listening to the soft patter of rain against the windshield before stepping out into the cold, damp air. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable: wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. The air smelled of old wood and damp earth, but it was warm. I lit a few lamps, unpacked my bag, and made myself a cup of tea, trying to settle in. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The wind howled outside, making the old wooden walls creak and groan. I kept waking up, heart pounding for no reason, staring into the darkness of the room. Every little sound seemed amplified: the branches tapping against the window, the shifting of the trees, the distant rustling of leaves. At some point in the dead of night, I thought I heard something else. A soft sound. Not the wind, not the trees. Something closer. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear over the storm outside. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Just the wind, the rain, the occasional crack of a branch. Then footsteps, faint, slow, just outside the cabin. My stomach twisted. Could have been an animal. Fox maybe, or a deer. But something about the sound didn't sit right. It wasn't the erratic movement of an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was deliberate, measured. I stayed frozen, listening. The footsteps stopped. I forced myself to lie back down, telling myself I was being paranoid. The isolation, the storm, the unfamiliar surroundings. It was all playing tricks on my mind. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up late, still feeling groggy. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest soaked and dripping, the sky still heavy with thick clouds. I stepped outside with my coffee, taking a deep breath of the damp morning air. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. In the mud, just beneath the window of the bedroom. I stared at them, my pulse hammering in my ears. They were fresh, deep impressions in the wet ground. Not animal tracks, human footprints. Someone had been outside my cabin last night. My first thought was that maybe the owner of the cabin had come by. Maybe they had checked in on me, but that didn't make sense. Why wouldn't they knock? Why would they just stand outside the bedroom window? I scanned the tree line, my skin crawling. The forest was thick, the trees standing tall and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I forced myself to shake it off. I spent the rest of the day hiking through the woods, trying to enjoy the peace and quiet. The isolation was starting to feel suffocating, though. Every time the trees rustled, I found myself glancing over my shoulder. That night, I locked the doors and windows. I moved a chair in front of the door, and I kept the fire going. But sleep didn't come easy. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I woke up again. Something had changed. The air felt different, still, heavy. And then I heard it, the sound of breathing, slow, deep, just outside the bedroom window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my body frozen in place. The breathing continued, steady and slow, just on the other side of the thin wooden wall. Then light footsteps, moving toward the door. A faint creak as something pressed against the wood. My heart slammed against my ribs, and then silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Eventually, exhaustion took over again, and I must have drifted into a restless sleep. In the morning, I found more footprints. This time, they led from the window to the front door, and then into the woods. I didn't stay for the third night. I packed my things and left before noon, driving down that dirt road faster than I should have. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over, my hands shaking. I never saw who it was. I never found out why they were there. But as I drove away from that cabin, one thing became clear. Whoever it was, they had been watching me. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out.